Chuck Yannacone. That's all you need to know. Mick, before I let you go, I want to reminisce a little bit about some of the times we shared together. I've known you since Mrs. Christensen's third grade class. And I remember after school we'd go back to your place, and there was a giant field behind you, and in that field was a very tall eucalyptus tree. And someone, I think your father, had strung a rope swing from that. And we used to play fort back there and swing on that swing, and we had a wonderful time. And I remember in later grammar school years, your mother, on the times when we would pass the first level of spelling bee and get to go to another school, your mother would manage to find the time to drive us over to those events. And we always had a great time together doing that and seeing what other schools were like, what the rich people lived like. The school that we first met at in third grade was in East Palo Alto. If you've ever heard of East Palo Alto, you'll know why. Talk about the better halves. It was a brick 3-story place, and it got torn down. It had been actually, what's the term they use when they say you should destroy something? Condemned, right, thank you. It had been condemned when my mother was a child. They finally did tear it down after many, many years. Your mother also took us to the Bing Crosby golf tournament. I don't even know if they still have that anymore. But every January we would pile in the car and we'd spend the night halfway there, and then we'd finish up in the morning. And I remember how exciting it was for both of us because you were into autographs, and there was one time when we got Bob Hope's autograph as he was leaving Bing Crosby's house on the Carmel golf course. The only downside of that whole experience was that it rained every single year. So that was too bad. In high school, we were both interested in journalism, and we were on the newspaper Bear Tracks at Menlo Atherton High School. And we were also on the yearbook staff. The yearbook staff I especially remember because we were the only 2 males in the class. So that was great fun, for me at any rate. There was a time in high school when you really impressed me with your industry. You wanted a car so bad that you went out all summer and worked in the fields picking fruit and vegetables until you got, I think it was $200 back then, until you got the money saved that allowed you to buy that car. It was a 1950 Ford Coupe. Coupe means you don't have a back seat, but what it did have was a platform, a solid platform, wooden platform. So if you didn't have the pleasure of riding shotgun with Mick, you had a very uncomfortable ride in back. You wanted to do some work on that car, and so you came over to my place, and I realized as we were talking, the reason you came to me was you had lost your dad in 5th grade. And I never really thought too much about that. But you came to me because I knew how to use tools, and you didn't know how to use them. You just hadn't had that experience, that exposure. And I felt bad for you, but I felt for myself so grateful that I'd had the opportunity to experience a father, a stepfather, and 2 grandfathers that were all avid tool users. You followed up when I was working at UC Davis. You came up to use the library one time, and I was able to introduce you to the people there that would allow you into the archives. And what you wanted to do was research your father's experience there. He'd been the editor of the school paper, and you knew that much. You didn't know much about his time when he was a student at Davis. And so we got you set up, and you spent the afternoon on microfiche finding about your father from a period decades earlier. And I was glad to be able to help you with that. One of the things I enjoyed most about high school was we came up with this idea of having a Menlo Atherton Country Club card. Now, we were known as the Country Club because we were one of the newest schools around, but also Menlo Atherton. We had a lot of the one percenters living in the Atherton part of our school clientele. So what we did was we designed this card. We had this friend, Todd Vipers, who was the artist. And so it said, temper justice with mercy on the top. I'll explain that in a minute. Temper justice with mercy at the top, placed a sign at the bottom. And then we had a caricature of our principal, Nick Nugent, reclining on a lounger, beach chair lounger, and he was sitting by a swimming pool. And we got a lot of kick out of that. But there were some people, I remember I was dating a girl at the time, and she wanted to know who had done this terrible thing. She wanted to turn him in. I never confessed. Shortly after we had the cards, we went on the Menlo Atherton High School Country Club raid. We called it the raid. And what we did was we were armed with stencils and paint and keys. One of our group, Dick Waldo, had managed somehow to get keys to the school from, I think, a friendly janitor. And so we went around and stenciled a bunch of windows, temper justice with mercy. And I said that I'd explain what that phrase came from. Our principal at the time, if somebody did something and they couldn't figure out who had done it, the intercom would come on and the principal would announce, the people who have done this, would you please turn yourselves in? I assure you that justice will be tempered with mercy. Now, we didn't buy this, of course. And I don't know if anyone ever turned themselves in. But that's where the phrase came from. Anyhow, we went through the school that night, and we did a bunch of stencils around the school on windows, because we thought that was least destructive, and they probably wouldn't hang us too badly if they caught us. But we also went into the administrative offices and placed our country club cards on all the administrative desks in the offices. Shortly after that, Mick and I, one night, decided we were going to camp out. And so we took our sleeping bags and went to the parking lot, the high school parking lot. And we thought it would be great fun to just see the expressions on people's faces when they came in the morning and, what are you doing here? And so that worked out very well. The people were surprised pretty much as we thought they would be. But we were surprised too, because what happened was somebody during the night had thrown paint all over the school, and they had put the paint cans by our sleeping bags. We were sleeping, we didn't know this. It was Mick who found out many years later that it was our erstwhile friends Joan and Shannon who had done this to us. We didn't know until many years later. Anyhow, and the paint went all the way back to Mick's car, which was off campus. And of course, the police came and they were able to figure out where that went. And of course, we were the guilty party. Well, we hadn't done that, but we had done the thing the week before. So because of this, we were prohibited from going through our high school graduation ceremony. So we didn't get to sit up on the stage. Now, Mick's attitude pretty much was, fuck them. But I said, no, look, this is a great opportunity. We'll go, we'll sit in one of the front rows right in the center, and people up on the stage, what are you doing down there? And that's exactly what happened. So that was kind of fun. I did chicken out ultimately. The following year, I realized I wasn't going to be going on to college that year. And so I chickened out and I went into the office in September and paid my $20 and actually got my diploma, which is somewhere up in the attic, I think. But Mick, on principle, refused to do that, so he never did pick up his diploma. Good on you, Mick. Right near the end of high school, there was going to be a major assembly. It was an evening thing, and parents were supposed to come, and all the classes had activities, and everybody was going to be represented. And the cultural commissioner, Judy Chaskin, she said, you know, I'm really disappointed. There are very few guys that are participating in anything. And so Mick and I thought about it, and we came up with this idea. Well, what we'll do is we'll have an all-male cast of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And so that's what we did. And so none of us was greatly embarrassed because we were all there together. And actually, the people liked it so much, they put that as the finale for that set of activities because it was so well received. We had a great time doing it, too. And Mick, you made a great Bashful. And speaking of Bashful, you were really shy in high school. And I remember it wasn't until your senior year that you finally asked Suzanne to a dance. And you only did that because you were afraid somebody else would ask her if you didn't. But I must say that in the years that followed, you thoroughly overcame any shyness you originally had. You told me about a time a few years after we'd graduated from high school, and you went to visit the Davises. Now, the Davises were a family that had two daughters that we liked a lot. We used to hang out there. We'd kind of eat them out of house and home, I think was the phrase the daughters would use. It was Pat and Linda. And so years later, Mick goes back. You told me about this, didn't you? You went back. You walked in, you didn't bother to knock, you know, these were friends. You walked into the kitchen, didn't see anybody around, so you helped yourself into the refrigerator, had a drink, had something to eat. Somebody comes walking down the hall and says, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Turns out the Davises had moved some years before. Mick visited me several times while I was in Baltimore. Do you remember that? And I remember Rich Costello and Mick and I went to see Mary Poppins in Baltimore. And afterwards, we were in high spirits, and we were bouncing down the street, skipping along and singing Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. I don't recall the other words. When I was at Fort Ord, Mick was one of the few people that kept in communication with me, and he would send me letters, and I really treasured those. And what he did was he started writing in sort of what I called an Old Testament, or very old Elizabethan kind of style, you know. And it was just kind of as a joke. And so, as I often did, I would follow his lead, and I responded back in kind. And so we had a correspondence that went on for a while. And I'm sorry to say I don't have any of those letters because it would be fun to reminisce for myself, if not for anyone else. I remember we used to get those of us who were close to you, we used to get these middle of the night phone calls, and you could be in Germany or Vietnam or the Monterey Language School, virtually anywhere in the world, and every once in a while, about 3 o'clock in the morning, the phone would ring, and I would know who it was going to be. And it was a very mixed sort of blessing, because on the one hand, I was delighted to hear from you. On the other hand, I knew I wasn't going to get any more sleep that night, and the next day I was going to be pretty wiped out. But long and short of it is, thank you. Let's see. I lived in Maryland for a number of years, and you came to visit me, and I'm really thankful that you gave me the opportunity to see a lot more of Washington, D.C., and Baltimore, and New York City than I ever would have seen on my own. I just didn't have the motivation. So we got to see the harbor where Francis Scott Key penned the Star-Spangled Banner. We got to hear and see Everett Dirksen on the Senate floor. We went to the Library of Congress. We went to the New York World's Fair, and we got a tour of the UN building. And that's all thanks to you, Mick. One winter we were in Manhattan, and it was so cold that we went from bar to bar, not to drink, but to get coffee because we were so cold. And we'd never been on the East Coast before. We'd never been through an East Coast winter, and our clothes were, was kind of like this, and we needed, to be bundled up. So it was a memorable time. And as I recall, we checked it out. The temperature never got above 28 degrees the whole time we were there. Going back to high school, I remember the very final assembly of the year, you got a writing award for a satirical article that you had written. And I remember how envious I was. And it turns out you'd cut that day, so you didn't get the award. And I don't think you ever bothered to pick it up. And I remembered I was tempted to try to pick it up in your stead, but I chickened out. I remember I visited you in Vancouver one time, and I talked about you were talking about what you had been doing, and one of the things you mentioned was some scripts you'd been working on, and I mentioned my interest in script writing, and so you generously shared several of your scripts with me, and one of those ended up being the basis of the pilot for the Grizzly Adams TV show. You could be really steadfast in your intellectual opinions, and you could hold on to them very, very toughly. Is that a word? And I admired that in you. But you always like to kind of go against the grain. I think you really reveled in that, in fact. But you also had a soft spot, as people have noted and as you've seen on the pictures in front of you. And you had a great sense of humor, and you had a really fond love of things that were cute. And I remember one of those things, you always seemed to like Snoopy from the Peanuts strip. I've always admired your creativity, your independent spirit, your intelligence, and yet at the same time, I always appreciated the fact that I could discuss anything with you. And I thank you for always helping me to feel safe and comfortable around you. We've had a long friendship. I really enjoy that. It's been a very special thing for me to have. And I think there's a poem that I came across the other day by Henry Drummond, and I think that's appropriate for me to mention here. If a man doesn't do more than he possibly can do, if a man doesn't try to do more than he possibly can do, he will never do all that he can. Mick, you did a lot. Thank you for the friendship and the memories.